Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Thomas Vandeburie, and I'm speaking today on behalf of C40's Port and Shipping Program. Thank you all for joining this webinar. The topic is absolutely in the title, Unlocking Sustainable Finance, Scaling Sustainability Loans for Ports. Taking a step back, over the past few years, there's been a rapid acceleration in sustainable finance, and ports are obviously very much part of that story. As many of you well know, sustainability-linked loans, or SLLs, as we're going to call them throughout this webinar, are currently all the rage for capital-intensive sectors. And they make a lot of sense if you think about it. As a borrower, if you can secure better, more favorable financing terms by leveraging your sustainability plans, that's a very compelling value proposition. But at the same time, and if you're participating to this webinar, again, you're well aware of it, only a small number of ports have publicly disclosed SLLs or sustainability-linked finance frameworks, even though many ports are actively considering them. So we're facing a very interesting moment, which is that ports faced a growing pressure to decarbonize, improve social and environmental performance, and build resilience. And to do so, they need flexible, scalable capital. And yet, they somehow can't manage to take advantage of SLLs. And this is exactly why C40, working alongside partners, including the IFC and IAPH, is driving a global movement to help these ports access the sustainable finance they need. And the context for today's session and for the C40 IFC IAPH initiative, the Global Port SLL initiative that we're formally launching today. I want to take a moment, folks, to congratulate formally the C40 and particularly their C40 Ports and Shipping Program under Elisa Crane's leadership, and also C40 City Finance Program under Claire McGrath leadership, for their visionary approach to this initiative. Over the past couple of years, we've convened global expertise, we've shaped market thinking, and we've built the political momentum we need to make this happen. That commitment wouldn't be complete without the IFC and IAPH and their respective contributions. And I want to make a specific thank you and kudos to the IFC and IAPH team that helped us shape this initiative, in particular their willingness to take on the complexity of port finance and their willingness to demonstrate thought leadership in a complex political situation as we're experiencing it today. I will forget a lot of people given the number of folks involved in the initiative, but I want to extend a special thank you to Maria Lopez Conde, Oksana Megle, Marine Tabari, and Christelle Van Veren from the IFC, specifically the global infrastructure, sustainable finance and advisory teams. And of course, I want to thank you, Patrick, from IAPH, for allowing us to mobilize the collective voice and the deep sectoral knowledge of your organization. Together, this initiative, the Global Port SLL initiative, is designed to close a critical financing gap. What we're effectively aiming to achieve is the first standardized framework for Port SLLs, a framework that is tailored to ports, provides practical tools, and ensures that ports everywhere, including the Global South, can access sustainable and low-cost capital. Today's sessions has four main objectives. First, as I just mentioned, to formally launch the C40, IFC, and IAPH Global Port SLL initiative. Second, to launch the Port SLL Toolkit and share its key findings. Third, to exchange insights from practice. And finally, to discuss next steps, specifically how collaboration across the ecosystem can help unlock this pocket of capital. The Port SLL Toolkit that we're going to discuss today is, of course, a great practical starting point. But we would really like to use it as a discussion opener. And today we have a top-tier panel that you will discover a bit later. So I suggest we begin with a focused presentation on that toolkit and the current state of Port SLLs, and then move into the panel discussion to then, as a nice segue, see how this market can evolve in practice. With that, let me hand it over to Tiphany Monplaisir from CPCS, with whom I've had the pleasure to work over the past couple of years, and will walk us through the Port SLL toolkit, setting the scene for our discussion. Tiphany, over to you.
Thank you, Thomas. Hi, everyone. My name is Tiphany Monplaisir. I'm a principal consultant and the climate lead at CPCS. For those of you who may be new to us, CPCS is a global infrastructure management consulting firm focused on the transport and energy sectors. We've been supporting C40 with different port and bus sector initiatives over the past couple of years, and we're very happy to co-facilitate today's session. Just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. All participants except presenters and panelists will stay muted so we can stay on schedule. This session is also being recorded and we will share the recording afterwards. Of course, if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to email communications@cpcs.ca. In terms of the format for today's session, as Thomas already mentioned, I will start with a short presentation on Port SLLs and the Port SLL Toolkit that we developed, and then we move straight into the panel discussion. As we go through the slides, feel free to type your questions or comments in the chat, and we will hold them for the Q&A at the end. And with that, let's begin. So we're going to cover three main sections. First, a bit of context on sustainability-linked loans and what they look like in the port sector. Second, a closer look at port-specific key performance indicators, or KPIs, and sustainability performance targets, or SPTs. You'll hear me use these two acronyms along with SLLs a lot during the session. And finally, an introduction to the Port SLL Toolkit. Everything I'm covering today is included in the toolkit, so you can think of it as a bit of a preview. So to begin, sustainable finance integrates environmental, social, and governance considerations into financing decisions. And for ports, this type of financing is becoming increasingly important as they work toward their decarbonization and resilience goals, as well as broader social outcomes. At its core, an SLL is any loan where the terms adjust depending on the borrower's performance against predefined sustainability targets. And this type of loan has grown rapidly within the landscape of sustainable debt. In fact, in 2024, SLLs made up about 72% of sustainable loan volume. Since 2021, at least 4 ports have publicly disclosed SLLs, and several more, including terminal operators, have developed sustainability-linked frameworks. So the appetite is growing, but it's not without its challenges. While we found that SLLs offer opportunities such as stronger sustainability profiles, flexible use of funds, and modest cost benefits, their complexity can be a barrier. When we looked more closely at the challenges with Port SLLs, we found 2 types: challenges that apply to any SLL and challenges that were more specific to ports. On the SLL side, you have the need to select the right KPIs, structure an ambitious yet realistic set of targets, and set up monitoring and verification processes throughout the life of the loan. SLLs also take time, they're customized, they're context specific, and that adds to the transaction workload. And because they're performance-based, lenders want confidence that KPIs and SPTs truly go beyond business as usual. Then there are the port-specific challenges. Ports have complex ecosystems with many actors, and responsibilities are often shared. And that means that a port doesn't have control over every emission source or sustainability lever, which makes KPI and SPT design even more nuanced. And there's also the fact that financiers may not always be familiar with port emissions boundaries or decarbonization pathways, which can lead to misaligned expectations and even longer structuring processes. But there's also strong opportunities on the other side. SLLs can strengthen a port's sustainability profile, support collaboration with tenants and partners, and create competitive differentiation. They also offer flexibility in the use of proceeds, which many ports value. And while the margin adjustments are modest, they do provide an additional incentive for ambitious performance. Zooming out on the SLL process, there are 5 core components. First, KPI selection. This is what measures the borrower's sustainability performance. The second is SPT calibration, that these define the level of ambition that the borrower commits to. Third is the loan characteristics. Those define the specific KPIs and SPTs to be linked to the loan and how performance against the SPTs will affect the loan terms. Typically, it's the interest rate that's adjusted based on performance. And then the fourth and fifth are annual reporting and independent verification. For ports, the first 2 components, the KPIs and the SPTs, are the most critical. Because ports operate across these complex boundaries and shared responsibilities, the KPIs need to reflect both what the port directly controls and what it can influence across the value chain. So let's take a look at port KPIs and SPTs being used in practice. SLLs are typically guided by the borrower's sustainability strategy, and many ports are already tracking environmental and social metrics as part of their annual reporting. We know that port sustainability priorities vary by local context, including economic, social, and political factors. And while there's no universal materiality framework for port SLLs, the International Capital Market Association's materiality matrix for ports and terminals provides us with a useful reference. That materiality matrix identifies climate change, biodiversity, and air quality as the most material for ports and terminals, and then circular economy, waste, water, health and safety, working conditions, and DEI as material. We included 2 additional themes, supply chain and community, which are notably important sustainability themes for the port sector. This materiality piece is a bit more illustrative to demonstrate the range of sustainability priorities across the port sector. But what we saw in the market is that port KPIs are generally grouped into 2 categories. The first being greenhouse gas emissions KPIs, which are the most common and widely accepted by lenders. And the second being broader ESG, environmental social governance KPIs, which cover the non-climate areas. Between these 2 categories, the emissions KPIs consistently ranked as the most material, while the broader ESG KPIs needed a bit more context and lender alignment. Scope 1 and 2 GHG emissions are the most common KPIs in port sustainability-linked frameworks. These fall within the port's direct control. They relate to emissions from owned or operated assets, such as vehicles, equipment, harbor vessels, and buildings. Recent examples of these SPTs in practice are shown on the right of the slide. The Port of Melbourne, Brisbane, and DP World have all included absolute emissions reduction targets or net zero commitments for Scope 1 and 2 emissions in their SLLs or their sustainability-linked finance frameworks. These types of KPIs typically resonate strongly with lenders because they are measurable, they're comparable, and generally supported by existing benchmarks and guidance. Scope 3 emissions are a bit more challenging for ports because they are generated by the tenants, the shipping lines, and other third parties, but they represent the majority of most ports' total emissions. This often makes them one of the most material port KPIs, and we're now starting to see ports begin to integrate them into SLLs through proxy indicators, which essentially are actions that signal influence rather than direct control. Some examples of proxy indicators could include investments in enabling infrastructure, such as shore power or charging systems, programs to collaborate with tenants on emissions reductions, and operational improvements that reduce overall energy use or congestion. We can see in the examples on the right one of these proxies in practice from the Port of Melbourne. The port included a Scope 3 engagement target in its SLL, which acted as a gateway for other SPT adjustments. What this means essentially is that the port's level of engagement with shipping lines, tenants, and other port users to identify areas to reduce emissions determined whether the margin adjustment for other SPTs would be applied within the loan structure. DP World went even further by adopting a direct Scope 3 reduction target supported by various strategies such as supplier engagement and data improvements. This target really signaled increasing ambition among port actors to link financial performance to areas traditionally seen as beyond their control. Beyond emissions, ports are also tracking ESG KPIs that cover other environmental and social priorities. These KPIs can be a bit more difficult to benchmark and quantify, so ports really need to ensure that any selected indicators are genuinely material, measurable, and supported by reliable data. Early alignment with lenders is also particularly important here to manage expectations and streamline structuring. Examples we've seen across the port sector shown on the right include targets related to mental health certification, biodiversity, human rights, and gender diversity. One thing to note here is that lenders may perceive these KPIs as less material than emissions-related KPIs, and so they often need to be paired with a stronger emissions-focused KPI within the same loan structure. So once KPIs are chosen, the next step is to set the SPTs or the sustainability performance targets. In general, the SPTs need to reflect real ambition beyond business as usual performance and beyond what is required by regulation. Borrowers are also encouraged to set annual SPTs throughout the loan term to help lenders monitor their progress, which requires a bit more careful analysis to be able to translate long-term commitments into annual or multi-year targets. For emissions-related SPTs, as we mentioned before, benchmarking is becoming more consistent due to the use of frameworks such as the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which contributes to them being preferred among lenders generally. Whereas for broader ESG areas, benchmarking is more likely to rely on historical performance, peer performance, or more generic frameworks. A keynote here is that although the loan margin adjustment is tied to SPT performance, more material KPIs and more ambitious SPTs typically justify larger adjustments within the loan structure. So that was a very brief overview, but I trust it gave you a good sense of the Port SLL market. And now we can talk about the toolkit. So last year, CPCS developed a Port SLL Toolkit on behalf of C40 and in collaboration with Impact Arc and Monument Economics Group, and with input from several financiers, port authorities, and SPOs. We've since updated it to reflect new market developments and stakeholder feedback, including a special review from the IFC, which was very well received. And the toolkit is essentially meant to provide practical guidance for ports on assessing their SLL readiness, identifying suitable KPIs and SPTs, understanding port-specific nuances, and preparing for discussions with lenders. And then financiers can also use it to strengthen their understanding of port operations, materiality considerations, and potential SLO structures. Of course, all of you can access the toolkit today. It's available through the QR code on this slide, and I believe it's also published to C40's website, which is where it's housed. But we do encourage you to keep an eye out for future updates, as they will surely be coming. That concludes the presentation portion of today's session. We'll now move into the panel discussion. As a reminder, please continue typing your questions into the chat, and we'll review as many as we can during the Q&A. Over to you, Thomas.
Thank you very much, Tiphany, for the very clear and practical overview of the Port SLL Toolkit and the current state of the market. As Tiphany mentioned, we're now going to move into our panel discussion on Port SLLs in practice. I will be moderating this conversation, and I'm very pleased to be joined by three Tier 1 panelists who bring very complementary, as you will witness, perspective from a leading port authority, a development finance institution, as well as a ratings agency. Thank you all for being with us today. I believe, Tiphany, we will start with a short video from IAPH, and then the panelists will have the opportunity to introduce themselves.
As IAPH, we very much welcome the initiative of C40 and IFC to develop a sustainability-linked loan initiative for ports. This is very timely because ports play a crucial role in energy transition, and they do that in a double way. First, there is, of course, the role that port plays in the facilitation of the decarbonization of shipping. But together with the shipping industry, ports also play a crucial role in transporting fuels and energy from places of production to places of consumption. It is estimated that 50% of the future low and zero carbon energy trade will pass by maritime transport. That means we need huge investments in new energy supply chain, and most of these investments will be land-based. This is of particular interest also to the ports in the global south, where we expect that production of new energy and new fuels will take place, and where we will therefore need to invest in export hubs. As a contribution to the discussions in the IMO on the net zero framework, we produced a study about a year ago that made an estimate of the type of investments that are needed in those countries, both in terms of mitigation, but also in adaptation and in preparing these supply chains. And we're talking about a range between 55 and 86 billion US dollars. This initiative is timely as well because, as we all know, the net zero framework of the IMO has now been adjourned with a year, which creates additional uncertainty because the whole framework would have included also a special fund for investment, amongst others, in port-related infrastructure. The initiative of C40 and IFC ties in also with other existing initiatives such as the Clean Energy Marine Hubs, which we support as IAPH together with the International Chamber of Shipping and the Clean Energy Ministerial. SEM Hubs not only brings industry together, but also brings governments together. And together, I think initiatives like the one that's now being put on the table by C40 and IFC, SEM Hubs and others, this is really the combination that we need to enable energy transition, not just of shipping, but energy transition in the world. So that's why, as IAPH, we very much welcome the initiative. We very much like to support it. Thank you.
And again, a special thanks to Patrick. We unfortunately could not have IAPH as part of the panel discussion today, but that organization has, of course, been central alongside C40 and IFC to launch this initiative. To kickstart the panel discussion, I will invite our panelists to briefly introduce themselves, and what I mean by that is your role, how it connects to SLLs in the port sectors, and then we'll dive into the questions. Tim, perhaps you could start, followed by Oksana and then Simon.
Thank you, Thomas. My name is Tim Dornham. I'm the head of sustainability at the Port of Melbourne. We are the largest container and general cargo port in Australia. So we transport approximately 1/3 of container trade for Australia. And 2 years ago in 2023, we commenced a sustainability-linked loan. Some examples were shared by Tiphany earlier, including topics of emissions and employee mental health. Looking forward to today's discussion.
Hi, everyone. Very pleased to be here. I'm Oksana Megle, Senior Investment Officer within International Finance Corporation. IFC is the part of the World Bank working with the private sector, including transport sector and ports. And IFC has been the part of the development of this report accompanying the C40 cities and international associations of ports and harbors for this important work. On our side, we provide our clients with sustainable finance, including sustainability-linked financing. And we have some experience of structuring sustainability-linked financing for ports as well in emerging markets. So we will be very happy to, first of all, provide some feedback on working on this report, on the importance of this product for the sector, and also some feedback from the direct experience with ports.
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Simon Böhmer. I'm a sustainable finance analyst with Moody's Ratings. I've been part of Moody's for 7 years now. The first half spent in the credit rating department, covering financial institutions in the DACH region. Second half, I had the pleasure to join their sustainable finance team, the EMEA one. I'm personally based in Frankfurt, Germany, and my responsibilities include framework level assessments, such as second-party opinions, which would probably be the closest link to the assessment of sustainability-linked structures. Also, to some degree, with exposure to sustainability-linked structures of ports, although none of these actually made it public, so there's nothing to read into in the aftermath of this. But yeah, beyond that, also involved in some company level assessments, namely our transition plan assessments called net zero assessments. Looking forward to discussing today.
Thank you very much to the three of you. We will now dive into the questions and bear in mind that we have a lot of questions. Of course, it's a very interesting topic, but we have to manage time. So if you see Tiphany unmute yourself, you're probably in a state of delinquency, just a heads up. But starting with the first question, and this one is going to be for the Port of Melbourne and IFC. What will be the most meaningful shift that you've seen SLL already drive, or what could they realistically drive in the way ports approach the sustainability of their investment?
Thank you, Thomas. So what we saw at the Port of Melbourne, we were probably one of the relatively early adopters in terms of ports choosing to pursue a sustainability-linked loan. We already had a range of public sustainability commitments, including some that are externally assured and communicated to investors, but a sustainability-linked loan is a really direct, tangible connection between what you're committing to do and some level of financial incentive or business case or connection to those non-financial measures. So it really elevated some of our existing commitments to be able to link some of the initiatives that we were pursuing to the fact that they are now directly valued by lenders as good business sense, good risk reduction, and something worthy of incentivizing. Beyond the loan itself and the financially linked aspects of it, just the rigor that a sustainability-linked loan provides that really shows that you are committed to addressing some key sustainability issues. So rather than just making some commitments yourself or voluntarily reporting on them, it really does demonstrate that you have the full endorsement and the full commitment to deliver on those targets. You've set yourself up for external review of them, and just committing to that level of transparency that you are going to meet those beyond the targets that you set within the loan itself it's a really good proxy for showing that you're serious about your sustainability performance, and that initiatives in other areas as well are getting good priority.
Thank you very much, Tim. Oksana?
I think I would share the view of Tim from the perspective of financial institution. We have noticed that the SLL around allowed clients who adopted this product to bring together several teams, which not necessarily work together, in particular sustainability team, financing team, and budgeting team, which might sit separately, sometimes in engineering team when it comes to finding practical solutions for achieving the KPIs. So making teams work together on implementation of a sustainability strategy in a very concrete way, in a step-by-step process, meaning that there is a constant commitment to improvement, and meaning that different types of solutions have to be identified, implemented, and funded on a regular basis to progress on the achievement of the KPIs. So this breaking the silos and the accountability are really, for us, the key levers of SLL, which it brings to advancing the sustainability strategies of companies, including ports.
Fantastic. Thank you very much to both of you. The second question is about the tension between the ambition and the feasibility of KPIs. And therefore, the question is actually twofold. It's going to be for Moody's and Port of Melbourne. The first part is, from your experience, which KPIs have proven to be both material enough and feasible enough, implementable enough for ports? And the second part is, according to you, where will be the biggest gaps that still make the Port SLL structuring challenging as of today?
Thank you, Thomas. So from the point of view of us reviewers, what I can share is that we sector agnostically try to really break it down to two key components. Of course, relevance assessment, materiality assessment of KPIs is a case-by-case analysis and differs from sector to sector. But what they all have in common is that we really try to base the analysis on, first of all, logically, the sustainability issue at hand that is actually addressed via the KPIs. But on the other hand, also the coverage that is included under the KPI. And a straightforward example, it was mentioned before, our greenhouse gas emissions reductions, KPIs, where the coverage is of particular importance. We've seen that Scope 1 and 2 emissions are largely established as KPIs in SLL structures for ports. I think they are very material. They cover what is under a port authority's control, and are a good measure to actually benchmark the progress that a port achieves in its own decarbonization. But Thomas, you mentioned it, there's a certain trade-off maybe between materiality of a KPI and feasibility. I think ports are part of a group of sectors that have a particularly large share of the emissions in Scope 3. And logically, increasing the materiality of a KPI from such a sector would involve also adding Scope 3 emissions into the KPIs and into the SPTs respectively. However, since this is out of the direct control of ports, understandably, it's kind of a challenging exercise to include them. So it is I think it's always a good step to also showcase your ambition via proxy KPIs. But developing this further and creating absolute Scope 3 emissions reduction targets that could be part of a KPI is probably, I would assume, the next bigger challenge for Port SLLs.
I think I can add to what Simon says, and I would agree with that. From a port perspective, when we were looking at the KPIs within our loan, certainly Scope 1 and 2 emissions was the top of the list. Our net zero emissions target had just newly been established, and so it made sense to embed that within a loan. As Simon said, scope 1 and 2 is relatively small compared to scope 3 for a port or for any infrastructure asset, essentially. And so we wanted to reflect the work that we were doing in scope 3 emissions, although we don't yet have an absolute reduction target, or we don't yet have the ability to set a specific target or metric, given that we have limited control over those emissions. And so what you saw Tiphany mention in the introduction was that we did come up with a proxy KPI for scope 3 emissions engagement to show that we are working with our stakeholders, we are interacting with them on emissions and climate issues, and there is a commitment in there that we will implement opportunities that are appropriate throughout the loan, and measurable ways that we can show that to our lenders without having to commit to something impractical, like a specific scope 3 number for something as broad as the entire port value chain. I suppose that's probably the challenge as a port, in that balance of materiality and practicality. Any piece of infrastructure really is ultimately providing services for its users, and so some of the really good sustainability outcomes that you can have as a port are things that you can do that enable others to have sustainability benefits that are not necessarily things that you can set a target for or you can lay claim for credit. And so how do you show the actions within your control that are measurable, that are actionable, that you can demonstrate to your lenders that you're doing, and show them the connection between that broader benefit that is having, beyond just what's being measured by the metric itself. I will say, other than the emissions targets that we had in our loan, we've done materiality assessments for many years, and so emissions is right near the top. A lot of economic drivers are near the top of our material issues as a port, providing good economic productivity for our state and country. But what we wanted to do is we wanted to also reflect some social impact in our loan. So we considered various health and safety metrics, health and safety being our highest priority social issue. Physical safety metrics such as injury rates were seen as not ambitious enough to be setting within a loan. They should be business as usual, that you have injury reductions. And so mental health and our workplace wellbeing program was something that we wanted to demonstrate that we were actioning. And so, again, that's something that's challenging to measure, but we committed to an external certification program that demonstrates the training and the initiatives and the awareness that we have throughout our employees for mental health. So that was a way to link something that's a broad sustainability outcome, but tie it to a distinct measure and certification and standard, so that there's some independence there in showing that we've met that goal.
And I guess the same tension, the same trade-off, and you've touched upon it, also applies within each KPI to the setting of the sustainability performance targets. And so the next question is going to be mostly for IFC and Moody's, but how do you see ports striking the right balance between ambition and realism when setting these SPTs? And what does the market look for when evaluating that balance?
I can begin answering this question. So of course it's not an easy question, and the answer would be different depending on the region and on the country context for these specific ports operations. But globally, the criteria which can help us to assess at which level the ambition can be set or should be set is, first of all, the review of the historic performance for that specific KPI. and then looking at the peers in the same country or in the same region, that what sustainability-linked product principles will require for an assessment of the target. So this is, I would say, similar for any type of sustainability-linked instrument, but specifically for a port, there are three things which would help us to understand is the balance set at the right level or not. The first one is the regulatory environment in regards to a specific KPI. For instance, in certain countries, the renewable energy cannot be installed on the site of the ports. So there would have to be other types of solutions. In certain countries, that's an independent entity which brings the energy to the ports. So the ports would have to find the solutions to procure that energy. So the regulatory environment in the country, first one. The second one is the available technologies. If we are talking about Scope 3 emissions, for instance, in terms of clean fuel, green ammonia, in terms of some of the technologies, maybe shore power. So in certain countries, and from IFC perspective, we are talking about the emerging markets, such technologies can be not available or not easily available. And in such case, of course, we would have to take this into consideration. And we would also look at the ecosystems and the players and what is actually within the perimeter of the port's direct control and its area of influence. Because maybe for the areas under port's direct control, we would be looking at more ambition versus the areas which are in the influence of the port. There we understand that the action is more difficult. So regulatory environment, technologies, and the control versus influence. These are from our perspective on setting SPTs. And on the market side, of course, market would be looking at the application of the sustainability-linked loan principles in the assessment of the level of ambition. So comparing against the historic performance, against peers, and against some external references like SBTi guidance, SBTi pathway. That's an external reference for GSG emissions. And of course, in the emerging markets, we would be looking at countries' climate commitments, where a certain country would have a more advanced level of commitment. We would expect that the operators in those countries would be having maybe also commitments which are more ambitious than for those operating in countries where the governments did not take such commitments.
Yeah, I can only add to what Oksana already touched on. I think it makes sense to really closely look at what the sustainability-linked loan principles ask for in this context, both for us as reviewers, but also when drafting or structuring SPTs in a sustainability-linked framework. Because I believe the three benchmarks that Oksana already mentioned, they can be really key to, first of all, structure material or ambitious SPTs, but also ensure that these are actually realistic and feasible also in the local context. And so we as reviewers also closely stick to these three benchmarking approaches, starting, of course, with a peer comparison or comparison against the historical context. This is usually what we refer to as the indication whether there's efforts exercised beyond a business as usual scenario. While it's these days not as simple anymore as looking whether the targeted progress will be achieved at a faster or higher pace than developments have happened in the past. Because oftentimes issuers already started or borrowers already started on their sustainability journey, already started implementing, for example, emissions reduction measures. We still think it's vital to look back at where the issuer is coming from or the borrower is coming from, what can be expected, and compare the level of ambition that is baked into the forward-looking SPTs with the historic performance. Next of all, benchmark against international standards. One of the more challenging things to do for many types of KPIs, for again greenhouse gas emissions reduction KPIs, it has been rather standardized recently, not just recently, but you do have sometimes science-based pathways, ideally even sector-specific. I believe for the port sector, as far as I'm aware, there's no clear decarbonization pathway that is really port-specific, where you could measure it maybe on an intensity base. But still, the SPTI sector-agnostic decarbonization pathways, I think, give a good indication of what the market generally expects in terms of absolute emissions reductions. And that is something that structures can actually reference in making sure there's a certain level of ambition baked into the SPTs. And then finally, ultimately, also as a bit of a plausibility check, maybe a peer comparison, both on the international and local level, I would say, to really factor in local specificities, to make sure that sustainability issues that are sector-specific or region-specific are factored in, give additional flavor to us in figuring out whether we're actually talking about something that is truly ambitious or something that might be lagging behind the average of the sector.
Thanks to both of you. Appreciate it. The next question, I think, is going to be particularly interesting, considering that all of you, in different perspectives, have been involved firsthand in negotiating and assisting in Port SLLs. So from a practical standpoint, what have you witnessed as being the most common bottlenecks in getting a Port SLL from the initial concept to a signed deals? And the follow-up of that will be, what will be your best lessons learned, your recommendations for how the lenders, their advisors, and the reviewers can help accelerate the process? And I suggest we go Tim, Simon, and Oksana in that order.
Thanks, Thomas. I would say for us, there was a long process in considering and then committing and then structuring our sustainability linked loan. One thing that I think is really great about this new Port SLL toolkit and guidance is that it gives such a good summary of common approaches, lessons learned, the balance of material issues and challenges in the sector. I think this toolkit is a really great resource for that reason, because one of the bottlenecks or most important things for us was just establishing what are those key topics that we are going to build into the loan, what are the commitments and the targets and the measures, and what is that right balance between them being meaningful sustainability commitments that can yield outcome, and strikes that balance between ambitious enough but also achievable enough. As we were sort of an early adopter as a port, we didn't have a lot of other examples of other ports and what they had done and why they had set that balance within their loan. And so just having those discussions with our lenders and with the various other parties about, here's what we think are our key sustainability issues, here's some proposed targets that we're considering, what do you think? Even those early discussions can take quite a long time if there's not alignment or understanding of what actually is material for your business. I think that will improve now with guidance such as this toolkit that shows, look, generally for ports, these are some common material issues, but it does take a lot of time to get comfortable if the port is not familiar with the sustainably linked loan approach, or if the lender is not familiar with ports and sustainability issues specifically, then there can be a bit of education in both directions. One thing that I think helps accelerate that, and that this toolkit will help provide, is having a common understanding of, look, here are some common topics and common types of targets that are generally applicable to a port and generally seen as ambitious based on the type of external benchmarks that we've mentioned. But also for a port and for a lender having that discussion, understanding what are also maybe some of the unique circumstances for any given port. There were two other Australian ports listed in Tiphany's introduction, Brisbane and Newcastle. They also have loans. Some of their targets are slightly different to ours because their operating model is slightly different, and their ability to influence certain aspects of those same topics is different. So the bottleneck and the suggestion I would have is have that initial discussion around what are generally the key topics that should be relevant in a loan, and what is unique about this particular transaction that might deviate from that. And if you can understand those two things and get on the same page, then the actual targets and the annual commitments and the margins, etc., are relatively straightforward if you start with that big picture question.
Yeah, what I would add is so as reviewers, we usually get involved when the drafting of it's usually frameworks that we look at has been quite advanced. So ideally, the hard part, the work intense part on the counterparty side is mostly done, especially for sustainability linked frameworks, which tend to be a bit more straightforward in the analysis, simply due to the fact that the KPIs have been defined, the SPTs have been defined, and it's a matter of us assessing that. So the degree of information that we require is usually a bit lower than for comparable use of proceeds instruments. Nevertheless, I believe it's absolutely crucial from the early stage on when we get into the exchange with our clients to clearly outline our methodological approach. Because sometimes issuers or borrowers with good intentions draft their frameworks and include a lot of KPIs, ideally covering all parts of the ESG or sustainability journey that the entity targets, and by doing so pursues to have a holistic approach to covering all sets of their E, S, and G components. Which could create, however, or could actually impede or undermine the actual purpose on our end if there's a lack of a commitment to always use multiple KPIs together. And as practical examples, we've had these cases where we have analyzed frameworks with 7, 8 different KPIs. Maybe 2 or 3 of them were truly material and core to the issuer's business. And the other one were kind of secondary nature. And then when we don't have the commitment that all KPIs will be used in combination, or it's somehow ensured that the core KPIs are always included in structures, we simply have to take the simple average in consolidating the overall relevance score at framework level, which sometimes then catches issuer at surprise. That actually try to achieve the opposite when including all of these KPIs. So it's absolutely vital to make sure that every bit of our methodology is understood from the kickoff of the analytical phase on. And to do that, it has proven practical to work with illustrative examples, ideally coming from the sector that the client is coming from. Because we, as reviewers, strictly need to refrain from any sorts of advisory, but we can explain our methodology clearly. We can use these illustrative examples, and these can really come a long way and really facilitate a smoother process. Because usually the fewer the changes are to the framework during the review period, the quicker and smoother the review period and generally is. And therefore, yeah, I would say this hugely facilitates a smooth process. And maybe us as reviewers, it's really on us to draft the questions clearly and be available for follow-up questions, potentially explaining the rationale for certain questions, where we're coming from, why this is of interest to us. Yeah, this is really what we need to bring across to to facilitate a smooth process.
On IFC side, from the perspective of financial institution, sometimes we act as a sustainability coordinator, helping the clients to structure SLL. So for ports, it's of essence that there is an understanding both on the side of our client and on the side of the structuring team, on the financing side of the product. Because very often we, especially in the emerging markets, we have been dealing with companies which have heard about the product, but they don't necessarily understand what are the constraints. So in these regards, this toolkit will be very helpful for these ports to understand what are the requirements of the product, what are the prerequisites. One thing in particular, which is important to have in mind, and some of the ports have in emerging markets do not realize that, is that a sustainability-linked instrument is not the way to structure sustainability strategy. It's the vector of the sustainability strategy. So it is an instrument which supports the strategy and not the ones which defines the strategy. And that was sometimes a very difficult point, because some of the ports have been expecting that through the use of this product, they would be able to develop the sustainability strategy, which is not the case. We can talk about an advisory support before, and that's to the point what can be done to support these companies, providing this preparatory technical assistance, helping the ports to think through their strategy before they tap into these instruments. So this is one of the bottlenecks. Another one is the lack of data, and very often we are talking about GHG emissions, in particularly on scope 3, where the data relates to indirect emissions, the emissions from tenants, for instance, from vessels. This data might not be necessarily collected, available, or the collection is not accurate or not exhaustive. So that undermines the quality of the GHG emission baselining. And of course, then it's very difficult to set specific targets. So that's a second bottleneck. And I would say a third one, it's the having the focal point within the company and the endorsement of top management. Because if we have the right counterpart who helps us to collect the data, the one which is available, and then the one who ensures the link with the C-suite and the endorsement on some of the decisions which are being taken on the KPIs and on the targets, this is really the key for having a strong SLL. So these 3 points, and I think we need to work with ports on unlocking these issues, having a proper sustainability strategy, having the proper sustainability team, or at least an officer who is in charge of these topics. And the third one, having the right type of data collected, tracked, monitored, and reported.
Thank you very much to the three of you. And Oksana, specifically to you, you hinted several times when discussing these 3 bottlenecks at your experience, IFC experience in the emerging markets. And I think that overall you've been quite successful at developing Port SLL in the emerging markets. But according to you, according to IFC, what will be the key factors that affect the access and accessibility of Port SLLs in these emerging markets? And more importantly, what will be the key changes or the mechanisms that would overcome these hurdles?
Thank you. It's a great question. Not an easy one to answer, but I would say the first 3 prerequisites already to have the strategy, the focal point, the endorsement of the management team, and then having the data, so as prerequisites, and then starting from there, what might be an additional challenge in the context of the emerging market is the regulatory context, which is sometimes not really inducive for the specific measures related to sustainability, or it can be the question of cost. So there we are facing the discussions about the cost-benefit analysis of specific measures related to sustainability, and the implementation of the KPIs sometimes can be viewed as an additional charge, an additional cost. So this is the discussion which we face quite often in the emerging markets, and it of course comes from the realistic consideration of what is the regulator wants, what is the kind of overall global context within that country, and additional measures which the lenders might be looking into when they structure an SLL, a robust SLL, and they want a specific reduction of GHG emissions, for instance. The implementation of these measures would mean an additional budget allocated to this topic. There we might run into such discussions as the end of concession agreements. So how would, and that's particularly true for terminals, maybe less for port authorities, but maybe a terminal operator at the end of the concession looking for financing for, let's say, 5, maybe even sometimes 7 years or 3 years. Having the targets for a medium term would be challenging, and having such ambitious targets, which would require some investments, could create a bottleneck and an issue in this context. So very often, I would say the link between sustainability and associated costs is an issue. And then one additional aspect is maybe some of the priorities in the emerging markets might be different from some of the priorities which the ports could face in more developed economies, in particularly the preparedness for climate change. It can be a very significant issue and a sustainability matter for the ports operating in small islands, for instance. How do they deal with it? How do they implement, well, when it is a part of their sustainability strategy, how can they address that through sustainability-linked loans? That's probably something additional which we see for the emerging markets.
Absolutely. And in that case, the sustainability link component is probably a magnifier of existing differences between more mature and more emerging markets. But thank you very much, Oksana, for these insights. I think we're approaching the end of the panel discussion. And before we wrap it up, I have one final lighting round more than a question. Specifically, I'm gonna ask each of you, so starting with Simon, then Tim, and then Oksana, what's the number one thing the port industry needs to get get right in order to scale port SLLs? The one single thing top of your mind. Go ahead.
That's a good question, Thomas. I think many sectors are asking exactly this question: how to scale sustainability-linked instruments. I have more visibility on the bond side, and it seems like a lot of sectors are struggling. What I would imagine to be impactful in scaling SLLs for ports would be, and we've mentioned it before, including absolute scope 3 emissions into their KPIs and SPTs in a way as direct as possible. So if you really have, given the importance that greenhouse gas emissions KPIs take in that field, and given the substance of scope 3 emissions for ports, I could imagine credibly integrating them, generating the data to credibly integrating them into the SPTs, ideally link it to means for achievement in cooperation with some of the stakeholders, that would also make them appear reasonable and achievable, could probably be a trigger for actually upscaling SLLs for ports.
My response, I'd like to add to what Oksana said earlier, which is that a sustainability-linked loan is not a sustainability strategy. It should definitely work the other way around. So one thing that ports need to get right in order for more of them to seek these loans is to have an established strategy, know their key topics, know their commitments, and then seek a loan that reflects that and incentivizes that, rather than trying to define things the other way around, because that will be a bottleneck in the industry and for specific companies trying to set a loan if they don't have existing commitments. And on the side of lenders and financiers for loans and encouraging scale in the sector, I suppose using some of these consistent guidelines like this Port SLL Toolkit, getting an understanding of what the key issues are in ports, and seeking to work with ports that already have a sustainability strategy in place, so that when they come to you and say, these are our issues, these are our targets, this is all the things that we're doing and genuinely committed to, and then here's a small subset of that will be in the loan, that you as a lender can have trust that there's a whole lot sitting behind that, that goes into the loan, that you're then comfortable and much more efficient in signing off on the details of the loan itself.
I would say, to conclude, read the catalog, read this toolkit. If I could say about only one thing which we should do to scale up the uptake of these products, but for those of our participants who are working in the sustainability space and the port space, print this toolkit and bring it to your chief investment officer or chief executive officer, and really engage at the strategic level, because it's a way for the company to demonstrate what they're doing on the sustainability strategy side. This is a strong signal to the market, strong signal to the partners, to financial institutions and partners. So just be bold.
Thank you very much, Oksana, Tim, and Simon, for sharing your insights in such a comprehensive and more importantly, in a candid fashion. I think it's going to be really appreciated by the audience. It does conclude the panel discussion, although there are some questions from the audience that I believe Tiphany will now select and address to our participants.
Thanks, Thomas, and thank you again to the panelists. Definitely a great discussion. A couple of questions from the audience were already answered throughout the panel discussion, so I will filter through some of the new ones. There's one around the avoidance of adverse impacts. So it says, in addition to the sustainability links, is there also an expectation for avoiding adverse impacts? For example, biodiversity environmental restoration targets might be negated by harmful new dredging. Perhaps Oksana and Simon, you might have some perspective on how this is viewed in an SLL structure.
Yeah, actually, I already answered this question in the chat, but I'm happy to repeat this, the answer from our perspective. Sustainability-linked product would be going beyond the management of environmental and social risks. So, for instance, on IFC side, we strongly believe that the company needs to have the proper ENS management systems in place to manage these adverse risks. And on IFC side, we apply IFC performance standards to the financing which we provide. So this is the starting point. And then in many cases, the legal documentation related to sustainability-linked products, some of the lenders, there is this practice on the market that some lenders include the declassification event in case of the occurrence of some material, environmental, and social negative impacts, because it's related. I would think that this is more related to the risk, to the reputation risk perspective. So this is something which needs to be managed, of course, additionally.
Thank you, Oksana.
Yeah, I can only add to that. It's a fixed part of our analysis to make sure that while financing positive impacts, there's no negative externalities that come hand in hand with the positive developments. It's less structurally applied in sustainability-linked structures than it is in use of proceeds structures, but still we need to make a case-by-case decision, and where relevant, factor in the negative externalities, negative impacts that might be created via pursuit of the SPTs under the KPI, and it's a fixed part of the analysis, and it comes into play wherever relevant.
Great, thank you, Simon. Another one was related to alternative fuels. Oksana, I believe you already provided a response to this one, but better for the broader audience to have the response verbally. Ports can be hubs for alternative marine fuel production and supply. Would support for building an e-methanol or e-ammonia production facility within a port complex be within the scope for a Port SLL? And that can be for any of you who want to take this one.
I can maybe speak to that. At the Port of Melbourne, we are doing a lot of work in the alternative fuel space and trying to prepare our port for future needs. One way that can be reflected within our loan, we have a Scope 3 emissions engagement target. So that was the proxy KPI I mentioned earlier, where we didn't set an absolute reduction target because the timelines and the quantity and the trajectory of emissions reduction at the port is far outside our control, certainly over the timescale of our loan. But what our Scope 3 engagement target does include is demonstrating progress and initiatives that are working towards emissions reduction. So if we implemented a feasibility study or other activities relating to alternative fuels that eventually will lead to Scope 3 emissions reduction, that does contribute to that proxy KPI in our current loan. One example commitment that we do have is we have an industry working group with a number of methanol fuel producers, shipping lines, and port infrastructure stakeholders that we are doing feasibility studies and discussion of alternative fuels. The fact that we have that working group, that we've made that commitment, that we have initiatives underway, goes to our sustainability linked loan and meeting that target. So showing the action and the intent and the commitment, even if it's an action-driven commitment or an implementation type measure, is built into our loan for that Scope 3 space.
Awesome. Thank you, Tim. Anything to add from the other two panelists?
Well, I think it depends on the way the instrument would be structured. Such bunkering infrastructure or storage facilities for alternative fuels, we often see that in use of proceeds structures, and it's quite common to be financed with these kinds of instruments. But generally, I mean, we generally don't oppose to anything, but I could imagine structuring SPTs around just the build out of certain infrastructure that does facilitate, for example, the reduction of indirect emissions, i.e. Scope 3. So yeah, depending on the way this is structured, but in general, seems feasible.
Simon, you touched nicely a bit on a question that just came in around green loans versus SLLs for specific circumstances. Maybe you can shed a bit of light on whether there are certain circumstances where a green loan may be a quote-unquote better instrument compared to an SLL or vice versa.
Yeah, sure. Without necessarily differentiating which one's better to use, I think that's very, very case by case specific. But in general, what it takes for a green loan or any kind of use of proceeds instrument is a sufficient amount of projects that can actually, or eligible proceeds, eligible assets that can actually allocate proceeds on themselves. So it's not feasible for every type of issuer simply because sometimes the assets are not there to structure benchmark use of proceeds instruments. But if these available use of proceeds instruments, especially on the bond side, seem to by a large extent outgrow sustainability linked structures as of now. However, there's good reasons to go for a sustainability linked structure in certain instances, I believe. First of all, it nicely ties into the overall sustainability strategy or general transition plan of a company. So you could really put some commitment via drafting these SPTs and committing yourselves with a potentially financial penalty or financial reward, whatever the structure is, to the achievement of these targets, and that you as an issuer or borrower are serious about them. And then secondly, you're of course more flexible in terms of how you allocate those proceeds. So you don't bind yourself to or commit yourself to certain allocations, but rather to achieve an overall strategy. So you gain some flexibility in terms of using the proceeds you raise with an SL structure. So those could be instances where it might be favorable to actually go for an SL instrument.
Okay. Thank you, Simon.
Maybe
yes,
just
Oksana, please.
to complement, there is another product which could potentially be considered for ports. It's blue loans, which is a category of green loans, which are focused specifically on freshwater use and marine economy, blue economy. So these are also specific circumstances when the focus is on these two areas, when a port can raise blue loan. So that's a third alternative for our participants. And also on green loans versus SLL, maybe when we are looking at social KPIs for an SLL, it's very difficult to identify enough of social use of proceeds to consider maybe social loan, but it's much easier to incorporate social KPIs into an SLL in terms of allocated CapEx maybe to this topic.
Yeah. Thanks, Oksana. Maybe two more questions. There was one question around the applicability of SLLs to terminal operators. If I can just quickly add, Oksana, you mentioned terminal operators in one of your responses, so perhaps you can provide a bit of context from the terminal operator perspective. But I did want to note that the toolkit, though it was initially developed from the perspective of the Port Authority, we have since updated it to include additional insights that are more relevant to the terminal operator perspective. And SLLs are absolutely applicable to both the Port Authority and the terminal operator. But maybe, Oksana, I'll allow you to add some more perspective as you've seen it from the terminal operator side.
Probably the main difference, as you mentioned, it is applicable, but the main difference would be in terms of the direct and indirect control and influence. What is within the area of direct control of Port Authority and what is not in the area of direct control of a terminal operator. In certain areas, there would be maybe some blurry areas, but generally it has to be taken into account when we set up the perimeter of the KPI and even select the KPIs themselves. But of course, in both cases, what we have seen is that very often the Port Authority and the terminal operators within the perimeter of the Port Authority, they have to work together, or they have to kind of engage in identifying some solutions to advance on the KPIs. So that's also the value for Port Authority and for a terminal operator to use this product.
Thanks, Oksana. Tim, did you have anything to add there, given that you might be engaging with some of your terminal operators as part of your SLL Scope 3 engagement target?
Yes, so I think DP, well, the terminal operator, were mentioned in the toolkit as an example, and I suppose not specifically related to sustainability-linked loans, but we're a landlord port, and so when we are working with terminal operators, we're finding many of the same opportunities, challenges, overlapping priority areas, and so a lot of the material issues will be common between a port and its major terminal operators. As Oksana said, there'll be different levels of direct and indirect control or influence over different issues, but I mean, part of our Scope 3 emissions objectives are activities that the terminal operators may be doing. And so potentially, if you have terminals and ports both operating in this space, there's a common interest in achieving the same goals.
Thank you, Tim. Oksana, I don't know if you're still with us, but I was hoping to direct the last question to you. It's around uptake of sustainability-linked loans in African ports. Is it an entirely new loan market for African ports? Can you speak to that at all?
So I think there is an interest to this product from the African market, but so far we have seen only one transaction from an African port. It's a sustainability-linked loan with the Tangier Port Authority in Morocco. Which was the financing provided by IFC to the Port Authority, TMPA. So that's a specific example of the uptake of this product. But of course, it's probably the preparation stage and readiness of African ports in terms of having the strategy, having the buy-in, having the data. They have a longer journey, which often means more preparation. The KPIs can be different. The sustainability priorities can be different, and the role of the ports also. When we talk about social implications of a port within the country, that can be also different from the SLL, which we can see, for instance, in Australia with the Australian port operator.
Great, thank you. That concludes our question and answer portion. Thank you so much to everyone who provided comments and questions in the chat. Of course, if you have any more questions or additional comments, you can reach out to any one of us, CPCS or C40, or any of the panelists. We'd be happy to engage further. Thomas, do you have any closing words?
I do, Tiphany. I do have a few. But the first one is actually personal. So when a couple of years ago, I started rabble-rousing people across the port ecosystem about the potential to streamline Port SLLs, I was not picturing us discussing that with such a high caliber roster of panelists today. So I'm very thankful for that. In terms of the takeaways from today, and I will be extremely brief, I think that we can agree that clearly Port SLLs have the potential to drive meaningful shifts in how ports plan their investment and match their performance, but only if it's there to support an existing strategy and not to define it. I think that was a very clear point by the panelist. The second one, unsurprisingly, we've heard that repeatedly, is that getting the KPIs and the performance targets right is absolutely central, which means effectively that ports and their advisors need to focus on the material issues, make sure that targets are measurable, benchmarkable, and more importantly, track the right balance between ambition and realism. It also means that you need to be honest about the data gaps and work collaboratively to improve them over time. And I think the third and last remark is that clearly there are still bottlenecks to streamlining Port SLLs. And this ranges from internal capacity, data challenges on the port side, differing expectations across the financial markets. But the good news and the silver lining there is that we discussed very concrete ways to address these, and some of them boil down to more upstream engagement between the port and their lenders, clearer framework and guidance, including the support from the top management, and of course, being very biased there, tools like the Port SLL Toolkit that can help the participants to get a common language a bit more quickly. So there is also a strong message on equity, and thank you, Oksana, for putting the emphasis on that, ensuring that ports not only across the global north, but also throughout the global south in emerging markets can benefit from these instruments of SLLs through the right combination of technical support, of capacity building, and potentially of blended finance will be absolutely critical to drive that objective across the finish line. So in that spirit, I think it's fair to consider today's session as not the end, but instead a very starting point, and brings us back to the C40, IFC, and IAPH Global Port SLL initiative, whose objective is to not only assist port and their financiers to apply the kind of insights that you've shared today across the panel, but also continue to refine the guidance and the examples as the Port SLL market evolves. And last but not least, very tangibly, support a pipeline of credible, high-impact Port SLLs that can accelerate decarbonization and the broader sustainability outcomes across the port sector. The Port SLL Toolkit that was discussed in great length will be available to all of you to explore in more detail after the session, and we very much welcome your feedback and practical experience on practitioners as you use it. With that, a final thank you to our panelists. Oksana, Simon, team, thank you very much for sharing your successes and your challenges so openly. Final thank you to C40, IFC, and IAPH for your vision and your thought leadership in that space. To CPCS and Tiphany to you specifically for their excellent work in developing the toolkit, and to all of you in the audience for taking the time to join and for the work that I'm sure you will be doing to advance sustainable ports. I definitely look forward to continued discussion and to see a lot of you involved in future Port SLL initiatives. Thank you very much.